We continue now at the top of Daf Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 68b. On the previous summit, there was a machlokas amoraim between Rav and Shmuel on one side, and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish on the other side. Rav and Shmuel, they say that at the times of the Beis HaMikdash, when the Omer was actually brought, so then the actual bringing of the Omer is what permitted the Chadash, the new grain. And when there's no Beis HaMikdash, when the Omer was not brought, so then the beginning of the day of the 16th was generally the day when the Omer was brought, so at the very beginning of the day, that's when the new grain was permitted according to Rav and Shmuel. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, they say it doesn't matter if the Omer is brought, it doesn't matter if there's no Omer being brought, it's always the beginning of the day of the 16th that the new grain is permitted. The only reason we wait for the Omer to be brought, that's just la mitzvah, that's just a mitzvah to wait for the Omer to be brought, but it's not absolutely necessary in terms of the prohibition of the new grain. And we will know that there was a machlokas tanoim in the Mishnah as well, or what seemed to be a machlokas tanoim. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai in the Mishnah said that when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, so they made a gezerah, they made a takana, that Yom Hanaf Kulo Aser, that the whole day of the 16th, the new grain is Aser. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai seems to be saying, we'll see in a moment in this Amud, but Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai seems to be saying that on a Doraisa level, the entire day of the 16th is actually mutter. It was just a Derabonon, it was just a gezerah decree that the 16th was Aser, the new grain was Aser on the 16th. And for that reason, it seems that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, since he's saying that on a Doraisa level, the 16th is mutter, that seems to be in accordance with what Rav and Shmuel were saying. Rav and Shmuel also said that the entire day of the 16th was mutter. And then in the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda responds, and Rabbi Yehuda says, no, the entire day of the 16th, it's not simply a decree, it's not a Derabonon, it's actually Aser on a Doraisa level. And Rabbi Yehuda learned that from the pasuk which says, Aretzem hayom hazeh. And the Gemara now continues and asks on Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Again, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, they say even when there's an Omer, there's no need to actually bring the Omer. It's a mitzvah to wait for the Omer, but really the new grain is permitted at the very beginning of the day of the 16th. And so the Gemara now asks from the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Mishacharav Beis HaMikdash Hiskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai Sheyehei Yom Hanaf Kulo Aser. When the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he made a decree, he instituted that the entire day of the waving of the Omer, meaning the whole day of the 16th, is going to be Aser. It sounds like it's Aser on a Derabanan level. My time, what's the reason? Meheira Yibana Beis HaMikdash, because speedily the Beis HaMikdash will be built. V'yomru, and then people will say, Eshtakad Milo Achalnu Beheir Mizrach. Last year, when there was no Omer, didn't we eat at the Beheir Mizrach when the sun rose on the 16th? It was permitted on the 16th. So Hashta Nami Nechol. So now also, even though there is a Beis HaMikdash, now also we should eat right away. V'lo Yadi, and they don't know. The Eshtakad Lo Have Omer. Last year, when there was no Omer, Heir Mizrach Mater. So then, when the eastern part of the horizon got lit up, then it's mutter. V'hashta de'ika Omer. But now that there's an Omer, Omer Mater. It's the Omer that permits the new grain. And so therefore, it seems from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai clearly seems to be saying that in general, when there is an Omer, it's the Omer that permits. V'isal gadaitach lemitzvah. Now, if it should enter your mind what we're saying, according to Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, that we only wait for the Omer as a mitzvah, but it's not really the Omer that permits. So mishum mitzvah leikum v'ligzor, just because of a mitzvah, there's a mitzvah to wait for the Omer to be brought, therefore we should make a gezerah. That wouldn't make any sense. It certainly seems that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is saying that when there is an Omer, really it's only permitted at the time that the Omer is brought, and that's why we want to make sure to make this gezerah, because if we're going to allow at the very beginning of the 16th, at the beginning of the day of the 16th, it's going to be mutter, it's going to get confusing once the Omer is brought. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, you're actually misunderstanding Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai beshitas Rabbi Yehuda Amar. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai actually follows the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah. The Amar that Rabbi Yehuda said, min haTorah aser, even min doraisa, if there is no Omer that is brought on a doraisa level, the 16th is aser to partake from the new grain. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, ad etzem hayom hazeh, it says ad etzem hayom hazeh until this very day. Aritsumo shal yom, that means Aritsumo shal yom, and essentially it means that the entire day is going to be Asr because V'kasavar, because he holds Ad V'ad Bechlal. When it says Ad Etzem Hayom Hazeh, it means through this day. It doesn't just mean until the day, it means through that day, and therefore on a Doraisa level, the entire 16th is Asr. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, again, that's on a Doraisa level that the entire 16th is Asr. That is certainly not in accordance with the Amoroim, because again, Rav and Shmuel say clearly that in a situation where there is no Omer, it's the very beginning of the 16th that it is mutter. If there's an Omer, you have to wait for the actual Omer. And Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, they take it even a step further. They say even with the Omer, still the very beginning of the 16th is when it's going to be mutter, the beginning of the day of the 16th. And so therefore, essentially, you can't ask from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai on these Amoraim. You can't ask from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai against Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was following a different shita altogether. He was following the shita of Rabbi Yehuda that on a doraisa level, the new grain is going to be aser on the 16th. Again, if there's no Omer, that is brought. But the Gemara continues and asks, so misavar lo kevase, is that really true? Does Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai really hold like Rabbi Yehuda? V'hamiflag poligoleh, but if you read the Mishnah, it sounds like they're arguing. That's the whole point of what the Mishnah is bringing. The Tanan, because the text of the Mishnah was as follows in the previous Amud. The Mishnah said again, Mishachara Beis HaMikdash hiskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai sheyom hanaf kulo aser. When the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai made a decree that the entire day of the waving of the Omer is aser. Now there was no Omer, so that entire day of the 16th, it seems on a Durabanan level is aser. And then Rabbi Yehuda responds to that. Rabbi Yehuda responds, V'halom min haTorah aser, isn't it aser on a Doraisa level? T'chsiv, as it's written, Aretzem hayom hazeh, because it says Aretzem hayom hazeh. And so therefore it seems clear Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is arguing on Rabbi Yehuda, not in agreement with Rabbi Yehuda. And the Gemara responds, Rabbi Yehuda katoi. Rabbi Yehuda actually was making a mistake in terms of what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was saying. He was responding, but he was mistakenly responding. Who savar Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai midrabanan kamar? He thought Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was saying a drabanan veloi, but it's not true. Midoraisa kamar. He also was saying that the 16th is also on a doraisa level. But the Gemara asks hiskin katani. But the word used in the Mishnah is hiskin Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. That generally means a takana midrabanan. The Gemara answers to that. My hiskin. What does the word hiskin mean over here? It really just means dorash v'hiskin. He darsh in the psukim and made that takana, meaning again on a doraisa level. And the Gemara continues, Rav Papa v'Rav Huna b'Reider Rav Yoshua achli chodosh ba'ursa d'shitzar nagi shivsar. Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, they ate chodosh, they ate from the new grain. This is talking about outside of Eretz Yisrael. They ate from the new grain on the night of the 16th, which really was the night before the 17th. That's what we would call the night of the 17th of Nisan. In other words, they did say that it was prohibited the entire day of the 16th, but they weren't strict for the next day, as the Gemara now continues and explains, kasavri, because they hold chodosh b'chutz la'aretz d'rabanan. Chodosh and chutz la'aretz is only asur on a d'rabanan level, v'lesveika lo chayshinan, and therefore they weren't concerned with the sveika d'yoma. In chutz la'aretz, you do have a concern of sveika d'yoma. Maybe the 17th of Nisan is really actually the 16th of Nisan, so that they weren't concerned with. They were strict the entire day of the 16th, but they were not strict already once the night of the 17th came. And Rashi explains, Kasavar Chadash Chutz La'aretz D'Rabanan V'Lesveika Shema L'Machar Yashisha Asar Lo Chayshinan. They held that Chadash and Chutz La'aretz is D'Rabanan, and therefore for the Sveika D'Yoma, that maybe the next day really is the 16th, that they were not concerned with. And the Gemara continues, V'Rabbanan Devei Rav Ashi, and the Rabbanan in the yeshiva of Rav Ashi, Achlu B'Tzafra D'Shivser, they would eat the new grain in the morning of the 17th. They were a little stricter. Kasavri Chodesh B'Chutz La'aretz Doraisa, they held that Chodesh and Chutz La'aretz is a problem on a Doraisa level. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai Midrabbanan Kamer, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when he prohibited the 16th of Nisan, that was a D'Rabbanan. V'Chisakin Liyom Hanaf, and he made the takana for the day of the waving, L'Sveika Lo Sakin, but there was no such takana for the Sveika D'Yom, and that's why they were not strict when it came to the day of the 17th. And Rashi explains, Rabbanan Devei Rav Ashi Bo'lam Tunei Ad Sheyor Mizrach, they waited until the sun rose on the 17th, B'Tzafra the Shivsar, Dinami Shitzarhu, the idea was even if the 17th really was the 16th of Nisan, because of the Sveika D'Yoma, Harei Hitter Heir HaMizrach, but still at this point in time, it's already the morning of the 17th, and really it's mutter on a Doraisa level. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai just said it was problematic on a D'Rabbanan level, to Kasavar Chodesh B'Chutz La'aretz Doraisa, because they held that Chodesh and Chutz La'aretz is Doraisa. Hilka Chayshinan L'Sveika. Therefore, we are concerned of the Sveika D'Yoma. V'lo Achli Me'ursa. That's why they wouldn't eat already from the night of the 17th. There was a concern that maybe this was the night of the 16th. Uvitzafra Achli Le. But then once the morning came already, they would eat, because V'lo Chayshinan L'Takanas Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. They weren't concerned at that point with the Takana of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Misham de Gzeira de Rabbanan Hishem Yibana, because it was just a Gzeira de Rabbanan, the Beis HaMikdash will be built. V'chashu Rabbanan L'Migzer B'Yom Hanaf Gufe. And so therefore, on the day itself of the 16th, there's a Gzeira, V'Lesveika Lo Tiknu L'Hamtin Kol Hayom, but for the Sveika D'Yoma there was no such takana to wait the entire day. And the Gemara continues with another opinion, the most strict opinion. Amar Ravina says, Amr li, my mother said to me, your father, he wouldn't eat from the new grain only on the night of the 17th, which really was the night before the 18th, what we call the night of the 18th of Nisan. He waited all the way until the end of the 17th. The Savar Lak Reb Yehuda, because he held like Reb Yehuda. Reb Yehuda says the 16th is also on a Doraisa level, as we said, V'chayesh l'sveika, and therefore he was concerned with the Sveika de Yoma. And Rashi explains, V'savar Lak Reb Yehuda damar kol yom hanaf asr min haTorah. The entire day of the waving, the 16th is asr on a Doraisa level. V'chadash asr b'chutz la'aretz Doraisa, and furthermore Chadash is asr on chutz la'aretz on a Doraisa level, so it's all Doraisa. Hilka chayesh l'sveika lahamtin kol hayom. Therefore he was concerned with the Sveika de Yoma, and he waited the entire day. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Ha'omer ha'yamater b'Medina, the Omer, when it's brought on the 16th of Nisan, that permits the new grain in the Medina, meaning outside of the Beis HaMikdash, Ushtei HaLechem b'Mikdash, and then the Shtei HaLechem, the two loaves that are brought in Shavuos, that permits the new grain in the Beis HaMikdash for Karban Minchas and similar items. And the Mishnah continues, Ein Mevi'in Menachos Ubikurim Uminchas Behema, Kodem LaOmer, one is not allowed to bring a Karban Mincha or Bikurim or Minchas Behema. Minchas Behema refers to Minchas Nesachim, that's the Karban Mincha, the Mincha of libations that accompanies animal karbanos. One cannot bring from the new grain any of those karbanos before the Omer, and imhevi pasul, and if one does bring from the new grain before the Omer, it is pasul, it is disqualified. And the Mishnah continues, Kodem l'shtei halechem lo yavi, also before the shtei halechem, one shouldn't bring these karbanos from the new grain before the shtei halechem, but there, imhevi kosher, there, if one does bring it before the shtei halechem, it is still going to be kosher, even though one is not supposed to do that. Rashi explains, Menachos, minchasota, the Shita Mekubetzes takes this out, because it refers to mincha, karban mincha in general. Minchas behema, minchas nesachim, shel behema, again it means the mincha of libations. And then the Mishnah said, Kodem l'shtei halechem lo yavi, one shouldn't bring from the new grain karban mincha before the shtei halechem. Menachos, one shouldn't bring these karban minchas, mishum degabe shtei halechem ksiv mincha chadasha, because by shtei halechem it's written that it should be the new mincha from the new grain. Shetei chadasha l'chol ha-menachos v'abikurim, that means that it has to be the new one, the first one for all karban minchas from the new grain, kedim efarish beparakol karbanos, as is explained in Parakol Karbanos. And the Gemara says, Yosef Rabbi Tarfon v'kakashale, Rabbi Tarfon was sitting and he had the following question, Ma bein kodem la'omer l'kodem shtei halechem. What's the difference between bringing, let's say, the karban mincha from the new grain before the omer, where we say if one does that it's possible, it's totally disqualified, and before the shtei halechem one's not supposed to do that, but it's not disqualified. What's the difference between the two cases? And the Gemara continues, Amar lefanav Yehuda bar Nechemya. Yehuda bar Nechemya said before him as follows, Lo no, im amrit kodem la'omer. Lo means to say no, don't make a comparison between the two cases. Im amrit kodem la'omer, if you're going to say before the omer, there's a reason why it should be totally disqualified. Shekein lo huter michlalo etzel hedyot, because there we don't find any exception to the rule, meaning to say we don't find before the omer that the new grain is permitted, let's say by regular people. We don't find such a thing. The new grain is not permitted at all in that situation. Tomar kodem l'shtei halechem, whereas we'll say by before the shtei halechem, after the omer has been brought, shehuter michlalo etzel hedyot, you already have an exception, so to speak, to the rule, where now it has become mutter at some level. It's now mutter, the new grain is now mutter, not in the Beis HaMikdash, but it's mutter lehedyot, it's mutter to regular individuals, and so therefore it's a more lenient situation once the omer has passed, and even if the karban mincha is brought from the new grain before the shtei halechem, it is still going to be kosher. And the Gemara continues, Shasak Rabbi Tarfon, when Rabbi Tarfon heard this answer, he was silent. And the Gemara continues, Tzahavu panav shel Rabbi Yehuda ben Nechemya, so the face of Yehuda bar Nechemya, it lit up, it became radiant that he had provided this good argument. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva, and so Rabbi Akiva said to him, Yehuda, Tzavu panecha she'shaftes hazaken, Yehuda, your face is radiant because you were able to answer the elder. To mieni, I'll be surprised, im tarech yomim, if you have a long life. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eloi, Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Eloi said, Oso aperek pras ha-pesach choya, that time period, it was 2 weeks before Pesach, kishalisi la'atzeres, when I ascended for the holiday of Shavuos, sha'alti acharav, I inquired after him. I wanted to know, Yehuda ben Nechemya, heichon, who wears Yehuda ben Nechemya? V'yamru li, and they said to me, Niftar v'halach lo, he passed away. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, L'divrei Yehuda ben Nechemya, according to the opinion of Yehuda ben Nechemya, Nisachim bikurim sheikrivam kodem liomer, let's say you have libations of the new wine that's brought before the Omer, Kesherin, those are going to be kosher. And the reasoning over here is that by wine, so wine, if it's new wine, it's permitted anyhow, without the Omer. You don't need the Omer. The Omer is there to permit the new grain. It's not there to permit the new wine. And so therefore, according to Yehuda ben Nechemya, if something is permitted to all people, again, we said that then if it's brought in the Beis HaMikdash, it's going to be kosher. And so that should be true of the Nesachim as well, even though really Nesachim, from the new wine, from the new produce, it really has to wait for the Shtei HaLechem, technically speaking. But if it were to be brought not only before the Shtei HaLechem, but even before the Omer, since it's entirely permitted lahedyo to regular individuals, so it should ultimately be kosher. And the Gemara says, Pshita, well, isn't that obvious? Of course, that's exactly what Yehuda ben Nechemya said. He said that if it's permitted lahedyot, so then if it's brought as a carbon, it's going to be kosher. But the Gemara says, not necessarily obvious. Mahu detema, what might you have said? Hasam hu dehuter michlalo eitzel hedyot, over there, when we're talking, let's say, about a carbon mincha, which is grain, so it's not just that it's permitted lahedyot, but it's huter michlalo. There was a prohibition that the Omer got rid of. So there we say, huter michlalo, it was permitted something that used to be aser. Aval hacha, but over here, when we're talking about wine, the lo huter michlalo, it's not huter michlalo, because it was never aser at all. So lo, so then no, maybe I wouldn't apply the same logic. Kamash malon, so that's what it's teaching us over here. That's what Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak is teaching us. Kol shekein hacha de lo itzer klal. Certainly, all the more so that if it's going to be used for libations, this wine from the new produce, it's going to be okay because it was never aser, and therefore, since it was never aser to regular people, therefore, again, if it's used for libations, it's going to be kosher. And Rashi explains, Nesachim bikurim, again, libations, miyayin shabiker kodem lomer, that's talking about libations from the new wine that ripened before the Omer, v'hikrivam ksherin, and it's brought, it's offered, it's going to be kosher, l'divrei Rabbi Yehuda bar Nechemya, according to Yehuda bar Nechemya. Why? The tali taima b'hola mutar and lahedyot, because he said it's considered to be kosher as long as it's mutar to a regular person. So haninami mutar and lahedyot kodem lomer. So here also, when it comes to the new wine, that's permitted to a hedyot before the Omer. The Omer eino aser ela min dagon, because with regards to the Omer, the only idea of chadash being aser is by the new grain. V'lo yayin, there's no concept of chadash being aser to a regular person by wine. V'hada katani masnisin v'imhevi pasel, and according to this, when the Mishnah says imhevi pasel, again it says that if it's brought before the Omer, it's pasel. Lav abikurim depero sa'ilon kai, that would not be going on bikurim, which are fruits, because again it's not going on anything in which we would say it's mutter lahedyot all along. That actually would not be pasel. It's only going to be going, let's say, on a carbon mincha, which is brought from grain. So there, if it's brought from the new grain before the Omer, it's going to be pasel, because there it's actually aser lahedyot. But again, after the Omer, where it's permitted lahedyot, then it's going to be kosher. And the Gemara then said, why is that a chiddush? Because ma'u detema hasam gabi menachos. What might you have said over there by carbon mincha? Kodem l'shtei halechem hu mehevi kosher. There, by a carbon mincha before the shtei halechem, it's kosher mishum dehuter mechlalo, because it's not just that it's permitted, but it's permitted from something that used to be aser. Shenaser lahedyot kodem lomer, it was something that was aser to a regular person before the Omer, v'huter liachar Omer, and then it became mutter after the Omer. Aval hacha, but one might argue that over here, by the wine, to lo huter mechlalo lahedyot, where it's not huter mechlalo lahedyot, sharei me'olam lo neser, because it was never aser in the first place. So aim alo, one might say it's not the case, but again, it is the case. We do say that as long as it's mutter lahedyot, so if it's offered on the mizbeach, in this case as a libation, it is going to be accepted. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Boy Rami bar Chama asks the following question: Shtei halechem, with regards to the shtei halechem, maushi atiru shelo kesidron, are they able to permit out of order? Rashi explains, Maushi atiru shelo kesidron lemikdash, meaning to say, in a normal situation, you have the Omer and then you have the shtei halechem, and the combination of both the Omer and the shtei halechem, that's what allows the new grain to be used for karban minchas in the Beis HaMikdash. But what would happen if it's out of order? What happens if the shtei halechem comes first and then the Omer? At that point, after the Omer, is that new grain now allowed in the Beis HaMikdash? Hechi decholef alayu shtei halechem kodem laOmer. Let's say the shtei halechem happens before the Omer. And the Gemara continues and explains this question, Hechi Dami, what's the case? How is it possible that the Shtei HaLechem would be before the Omer? It could be as follows, Kegon de Zarinu Bein HaOmer l'Shtei HaLechem. Let's say this new grain, it was planted between the Omer, it took root between the Omer and the Shtei HaLechem. And so therefore, that's what we go by in terms of being permitted. So V'cholaf alayu Shtei HaLechem evi Omer. So then what ends up happening is, first the Shtei HaLechem pass when this has taken root, and then comes the Omer, as far as this particular grain is concerned. So then do we say the Shtei HaLechem and the Omer have passed for this grain, and it is now permitted in the Beis HaMikdash? What's the halacha? Kesidron Sharion Shalo Kesidron Lo Sharion? Is it only in order that it's permitted, but if it's out of order, it's not permitted? O Dilma Shalo Kesidron Nami Sharion? Or maybe we say that if it's out of order, it is also going to be permitted. That is the question of the Gemara. That's the question of Rami Bar Chama. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabba says, Tashma, come and hear a proof from the following brisa. It says in the pasuk, V'im takriv minchas bikurim. It says if the minchas bikurim is going to be offered, what is this talking about? What is this minchas bikurim? B'minchas ha'omer ha'kasem medaber. It's talking here in the pasuk about the minchas ha'omer, the bringing of the omer. Now mehechon ba. Now from what does it come? What is the omer? What kind of grain is used? Min hasoren, it comes from barley. At omer min hasoren. Now you're saying that it's from barley. Oeno ela min achitin, but maybe it's from wheat. How do we know that it's from barley? And so the brisa continues. Rabbi Eliezer Omer. Rabbi Eliezer says the way we know that it's from Saorin is because Nemar Aviv b'Mitzrayim. It says the word Aviv in Mitzrayim. That's talking about by the Makkah of Borod, the Makkah of hail, and it mentions that the hail was destroying the barley. That's going to be the idea. V'Nemar Aviv Ladoros, and then it says Aviv also Ladoros, meaning with regards to the Omer. Ma Aviv ha'Omer b'Mitzrayim Saorin, just like the Aviv that is stated by Mitzrayim, it's in reference to Saorin, in reference to barley. Af Aviv ha'Omer Ladoros, so to the Aviv that's Ladoros, that's for all generations, again referring to the Omer, Saorin it's referring to barley. And the Brisa continues with another source how we know that the Omer is barley. For Rabbi Akiva Omer, Rabbi Akiva says, Matzinu Yachid Shemevi Chovasum and Achitin, we find individuals that they bring their obligation of a karban mincha from chitin, from wheat, V'chovasum and Hasorin. We also find sometimes the obligation is brought from barley, like by the Sota who brings barley. V'tzibor, we also have communal offerings, Shemevian Chovasum and Achitin. There are obligations brought from wheat from the communal offerings, and Mevian Chovasan min Hasorin, and they also should have to bring their obligation from barley as well. There must be some example of a communal obligation from barley. If you're going to say that the omer comes from wheat, so lo matzinu tzibor shemevi chovaso min asron. We don't find any example of the tzibor bringing an obligation from barley. There must be some example, and so therefore it must be the omer is brought from barley. And Rabbi Akiva continues with another source, davar acher, another explanation. Imata omer ba min achitin. If you are going to say that the omer comes from wheat, so then ein shtei halechem bikurim. So then it's not going to come out that the shtei halechem is bikurim. It's not really going to be the first of that grain being brought as a carbon, because the omer is the first of that grain. If they are both from wheat, if both the omer and the shtei halechem are from wheat, so then the omer really is from the first wheat. It's no longer going to be the shtei halechem that is from the first wheat. Rashi explains, ein shtei halechem bikurim sharei tikrav lemizbeach mechite shana zu. You've already offered on the mizbeach something from the wheat of this year. V'rachmana karinu bikurim, yet the Torah, it refers to the shtei halechem as bikurim, t'chsivu v'yom ha-bikurim, because it says v'yom ha-bikurim, so it has to be that the shtei halechem are the first offering from the wheat of the new year, and therefore it must be that the omer is not brought from the wheat of the new year, rather it is brought from the barley of the new year. But the Gemara now continues and says, this is the last proof of Rabbi Akiva, but v'im isa the shtei halechem shelo kesidron sharian, if it's going to be argued that the shtei halechem out of order is able to permit, so then actually it is possible that the shtei halechem and the omer come from wheat, but the shtei halechem is the first wheat of the new year. The reason for that being is you might have a wheat that was permitted out of order. In other words, you have a regular wheat where you had the omer and then the shtei halechem. It went through that whole cycle, and now that's able to be brought as the omer. But then you might have another wheat which goes through the cycle out of order. It goes through the cycle shtei halechem first and then the omer. So then if that's used for the shtei halechem, that's the first of that particular new wheat. As the Gemara now explains, mashkachas la to makriv omer mehanach de eshesh kodem l'shtei halechem. You can have the following scenario: one offers the omer from that wheat which took root before the shtei halechem, but uvaser omer deshtakid, but after the omer last year, since it took root after the omer last year, it can be used for the omer. It's new grain as far as the omer is concerned. And then ushtei halechem, and then you can have the shtei halechem be brought mehanach de eshesh kodem la omer, from that which took root before the Omer dehashta, the Omer of now, ubasar shtei halechem deshtakad, but after the shtei halechem from last year, meaning a normal, typical situation where you have that which took root before the Omer and now took root before the Omer, and now the shtei halechem comes and you bring it a shtei halechem, and so essentially you have wheat, and it's always considered to be new wheat, and so therefore it seems it cannot be that it permits out of order, because if it permitted out of order, this second proof of Rabbi Akiva would not make sense. And the Gemara continues and says, is that really true? Misavrit, do you think? And Rashi explains, V'misa de shalo kesidra and shari, and if it comes out that out of order can be permitted, mashkachas la deva omer min hachitim, it could be that the omer does come from wheat, v'havalu shtei halechem bikurim, and still the shtei halechem will be the new wheat. Kagon de zara be'ir de eshrosh kodem l'shtei halechem. You can have a situation as follows. Let's say you plant some wheat in Eor, and it takes root before l'shtei halechem de shtaket, it takes root before the shtei halechem of the year before, u'shtei halechem de hanoch, and then the shtei halechem that you're bringing now, de zara betamuz de eshrosh kodem lomer. So that was planted in Tammuz, and it took root before the Omer de ha'inna, before the Omer of this year. U'levasar shtei halechem de shtaket, it took root after the shtei halechem of last year. So you have some that took root before the shtei halechem of last year, and some that took root after the shtei halechem of last year. The havalu bikurim l'chol chitim. Now all the wheat is going to be considered bikurim, each for its own. The talu behem, the halo karav mehano chitin, the talu b'shtei halechem doidna, the hano chitim da'asa omer minayu. It's not the same wheat, the one that you're bringing for the omer, that you're bringing for the shtei halechem. It's all considered new with regards to what's being brought. Sharinu shtei halechem de'ishtakid, v'hay omer asa minayu. Again, that was permitted by the shtei halechem of last year that the omer is coming from. V'hanach shtei halechem dehashta have bikurim l'chol menachos abos, and the shtei halechem that's now being brought is also the first for all the karban minchas that are being brought, me'osan chitim sheboim lahatir, from that particular wheat that is coming to matir, to permit. Elami de lo amar hachi, but from the fact that he doesn't say this, shma mino akati lo ishtri omer hanach chitim, the hanach shtei halechem deshtakad, you see that it doesn't permit out of order. It doesn't matter that it went through a shtei halechem first and then an omer, it still needs another shtei halechem to be permitted. Sharulahu, v'yahava asi omer minayu ishtakach, da'achal bepesach mehanach chiti, t'talu b'shtei halechem do'inna v'lo have bikurim, and it's not really bikurim. It must be again that it doesn't permit out of order, because then the argument of Rabbi Akiva will not make sense. But the Gemara then continues and says it's not true. Even if it permits out of order, the argument could make sense. Misavrid haid debuinan shtei halechem. Do you think that by the shtei halechem? And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Samech Tes Amud Aleph.